Internationally, Canada is often ranked as one of the world's better democracies. Even so, we the people are increasingly turning away from the political process. To talk about why this is happening, we're joined by Alison Loat. She is the co-author of Tragedy in the Commons. Former members of Parliament speak out about Canada's failing democracy. She's also co-founder and executive director of the nonpartisan think tank, Samara. Welcome back to the agenda and to the agenda this summer.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Tragedy in the Commons is the name of the book. What are you referring to?
Well, this summarizes really what a lot of the MPs felt was one of their biggest struggles when they were on the Hill. And it was articulated best by Keith Martin, who was an MP from Vancouver Island for many years, who said, too many of us sacrifice the long-term good of the country on the altar of short-term gain, political gain. And it's a play, of course, on the essay Tragedy of the Commons, which was written in the 1960s about the tension between narrow short-term interests and the long-term well-being. And in his case, the case of the essay was about the environment, but we thought it was sort of an apt usage of it, as it really did apply to what the MPs told us they struggled with every day in Ottawa.
You and your co-author spoke to 80 former MPs, Keith Martin being one of them. I mean, what was the process involved in speaking to them? What did it entail? It
was a fascinating, frankly, privilege. We were trying to figure out how to get at that conundrum you outlined at the beginning about sort of Canada internationally versus what we're feeling at home. And we thought, let's go closest to the source. We learned that exit interviews, which are really common in all kinds of organizations, had never been done before in Parliament. So we partnered with an organization called the Association of Former Parliamentarians, like the Alumni Association, really. And they invited former MPs to speak with us, and we traveled across the country, often to the living rooms or a nearby cafe in these MPs' communities, and spoke to them about why they decided to run, what worked about it, what didn't, what frustrations they had, what inspirations they had, and what advice they would give all of us on how to strengthen our democracy. So it was a wonderful sort of peek behind the curtain and also a very personal reflection for many of those MPs.
So sort of the themes that emerged from talking to these 80 MPs was that, it's sort of a depressing sort of theme, is that Canadian democracy's failing. I think you have a line in the book that says Canadians are checking out of democracy in droves. We're going to parse that, but overall, I mean, why are we seeing this happen?
Well, and that's exactly the question that we sought out to ask. I mean, this is a terrific country. I think anybody who lives here knows we're comparably quite blessed. But have we started to take the system that's enabled that to happen for granted a little bit? And so why are people turning away is a much bigger question. There's a number of different reasons, but one of the big ones is that people feel increasingly disconnected from their elected leaders. They don't see themselves reflected in them. They don't see the issues that elected leaders talk about as being relevant to their lives. So part of our goal with this book is to really provoke a bigger conversation about how politics can be more meaningful and relevant, because we know that politicians make very important decisions about how we live together, from when our streets can be paved all the way to what wars we might fight internationally. And if we as citizens aren't engaged in making those decisions, I do worry that our long-term prosperity might be at stake.
We'll talk about whether or not these former MPs actually feel that they're disconnected from the people, as the people that you say are disconnected from their politicians. But we'll talk about that in a minute. I want to first ask you, when you talk to the MPs, when they said, I was a business person or a lawyer or a teacher or whatever, I wanted to get into politics because why? Why did they want to get into politics in the first place?
Well, as many reasons as there were people we interviewed. One of the really common themes when we asked the question, why'd you get into this in the first place? Almost all of them evaluated the status quo and found it wanting in some way. So some of them emphasized something in their personal background that they thought was missing. So for example, people who had come or moved to Canada from other countries, Jean Augustine, a local MP here in Toronto, is a great example of that, who said, I didn't see myself. She came from the Caribbean. I didn't see myself or my voice reflected in the system. Other people felt a lot of frustration about an issue that they didn't think was being tackled. A lot of people from Western Canada felt very frustrated about the financial situation of the province. People from Quebec were very concerned about national unity. Some had been abroad. For example, Alexa McDonough talked about volunteering in the war on poverty in the South and said, we don't have those issues here, and I want to fight to make sure that continues. So as many issues as people, but almost all of them, it came from a desire of looking at the system and saying it can be better.
It's interesting. Of all those reasons, one that you didn't mention is party affiliation. I mean, to what extent did they say, yep, party affiliation is what sort of encouraged me to go into politics?
Well, one of the surprises to us is, and we'll probably talk about this, but how critical they were of their own political parties to sort of preview some of the disconnect point.
And we should just remind our viewers, I mean, you talk to people of all political stripes.
Yeah, and actually that's an important point. I mean, every background, every region of the country, and every political party, and there is a lot of consistency across the parties, which we're not used to seeing on TV, of course, but we're in those interviews. So a lot of them spoke about, maybe being involved in a party a little bit, but most of them had not been that involved in parties, or hadn't seen their party stripes as something that they were really, firmly going to wear. So, for example, MacMillan, who, Deputy Prime Minister, wonderful woman, she'd been involved in the Liberals for ages. She was a law professor and had moved to Edmonton, and she got involved in the party there really as a way to meet people because she didn't know anybody in Edmonton, and she never thought she was going to run because, for anyone who follows closely knows, there's very few Liberal seats in Alberta. So even somebody who had been involved in a party said, I didn't really think about it that much, which is sort of another thing we provoke in the book, just how many of them claimed that they hadn't really planned it in the way that I might have thought they would have.
One thing that, when we've talked about this in the past, you and I, that a lot of Canadians say, politicians only come from a certain segment of society. I just listed off, lawyers, which a lot of them are, and teachers. I mean, but just let's go through, how diverse is the background of MPs in our House of Commons?
Much more than I was expecting. Now, we interviewed 80, which is a snapshot. It's a big snapshot. But the most common profession of the people we interviewed was teaching, or the academy, or caring professions in some way. I would say, despite the diversity of their backgrounds, we had people who'd been in the military. We had somebody who'd tried out for the New York Yankees. That was kind of interesting.
Who is that?
It was, I think, Myron Thompson. It was one of the NDP, I should remember, it was one of the Reform candidates from Alberta. We had people, air traffic controller, priest, there were some lawyers as well in the mix, but a much wider diversity. But what linked them all was that they were very active in what we call the public square, in their own communities. So this was sort of a fascinating thing to hear them say, I hadn't really planned to run, when they had all been so active in provoking change locally. So it sort of made us think, did you really not plan to run, or were you really just a little embarrassed to admit that you might have a case of political ambition?
Because it is like when you see people politically active in a community, you think, okay, well, they might be doing this, and then they'll graduate, for lack of a better term, to the local school board, and then to city politics, and so on and so forth. But you're saying that people sort of said this kind of fell upon them.
Yeah, a few had that path, but many said, well, almost everybody said they were asked to run. So even in the introduction, we outline Paul Martin's description of not planning to run and being asked. And this is somebody who grew up as the son of a very high-profile federal minister, finance minister, in fact, who said, I had never really thought about it before. So we throw a little bit of salt on that narrative because it was so persistent. People said, I was asked, my neighbor came back every night for a week until I agreed. And part of it is, maybe they hadn't thought about it that much, but we also realized there's this tremendous reluctance among politicians to self-identify as politicians. They persistently sort of said, we were outsiders, it wasn't us. This continued, even they said, that behavior on the floor of the House of Commons, it was terrible, as if they weren't there. So part of it, I think, is what they're saying is they know the public looks down on that behavior,
right,
and looks down on politicians, and they're trying to say they're different. But the fact that so few of them, said things like, I thought politics was a really important way to contribute, troubled us a little bit. Because if they're not willing to stand up for their profession, then we shouldn't blame a young person, for example, for not showing up to vote.
So, sort of the communal theme was, I was asked to go into politics, and we have had a lot of discussion and debate lately about the nomination process, whether it's the Conservatives or the Liberals. This idea of how politicians get to be candidates has rankled many, and has been discussion. Overall, how effective is the nominating process, without being partisan, in the Canadian context?
One of the surprises to me in this book was how many people told us things we had never planned to ask them. So when we said, how did you get into this in the first place? I thought they were just going to tell us a quick story. And the number of them that spoke negatively about their own nomination process was completely unexpected to me, again, across the parties. Most of them said it was very opaque. It was confusing. They didn't know the rules. the rules would change at the last minute. The party would intervene at various points without really them understanding what was going on. And this was surprising because, of course, these men and women were the winners of their nominations. Like, we didn't interview the losers.
Right.
So I think it does beg for a little bit more scrutiny when the winners are criticizing a process. So I think we do talk in the book about the need for us to at least have a bit more transparency about how the nominations work.
And one of the things I'm always curious about is, like, person A from, wins a nomination, wins the election, and then they're sent to, like, Ottawa, Parliament Hill. I mean, how do you even know how to be a politician, right? They didn't go to school to learn how to be a politician. So they get to Ottawa, they enter into the House of Commons. How did they characterize their experience when they first arrived on Parliament Hill?
There were two emotions they articulated that hit them over the head sort of on day one. First was this huge sense of responsibility and, frankly, awe when they walked into Parliament for the first time. Several had said they had never even been to Ottawa before they were elected. So to see the building, it's quite a remarkable building, as anyone who's been there knows. But quite quickly after that, they said, and I realized I had no idea what I was doing. And they didn't have traditional things that many of us have in jobs. There was no real orientation. There was no training. There was no mentorship. I mean, they didn't even have a job description. So for many of them, navigating those initial days, weeks, and some even said it took a couple years to get your head around everything. Certainly not as smooth as it could be. So we talk in the book about how some simple, HR practices, for lack of a better word, might help.
Right, because there's no time, like with most jobs, like if I'm replacing you, we spend some time together, you training me. That doesn't happen in the switchover of politics, other than you get out of your office and I take it over.
Yeah, and then you have, a couple weeks to set up your office in Ottawa and your office in your constituency. So some of them actually, there was a persistent theme about their parties and the sort of difficulty they had with their own political parties, but this was another area where they would sort of seek advice from their fellow caucus members, and sometimes didn't always find it as forthcoming as they might have expected. So,
and what did they say? Was there this sort of shared consensus on what their role was, the role of the MP was when they first got there? I think that probably morphed as they got better at the job or on the job for a longer time. But when they first got there, what did they say? Hey, this is my job, my main job.
Well, we asked the question, what's the job of an MP? We thought, again, it was a sort of warm-up question, and this was another fascinating one. There were about as many answers as MPs, similar to their backgrounds in that sense. And sometimes it reflects the fact that it's a complicated job and there's lots to it. Sometimes it was a difference between the tension of representing your constituents locally, having a national presence, and also being a member of a political party. But often they just disagreed completely with one another. For example, one fellow said, those highfalutin people in Ottawa, that's not really what your job is. You've got to be at home helping your people. Another MP would say, I'm not an alderman here. My job is to be in Ottawa worrying about the national interest. So those are two people with the exact same job who fundamentally disagree with why they're there. So you can imagine coming to work every day where people had no shared view of what the essential purpose of their job was.
What is the job of an MP?
Well, this was another interesting point, which is that only 2 or 3 of them articulated the traditional Westminster definition of the job, which is to hold government to account for the passing of laws and for the expenditure of tax dollars.
Say that again. Most people don't know that.
Yeah, so holding government to account. So that's making sure that laws are being passed in the best interest and taxpayer money is being spent properly.
Okay.
And so that accountability function of the Member of Parliament is seen historically as the most critical one. Only 2 of them, or maybe 3, mentioned it. So it also sort of suggests that we have probably evolved away from that, at least in MPs' recollections. But that still remains a really critical function, and one that a lot of observers of Parliament have said has really declined. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, but it is troubling if MPs aren't clear on what essentially we're really setting them there to do.
And I got you to repeat that because I think, if you ask most Canadians, they wouldn't be able to articulate what the job of an MP is, but they have their own ideas of what the job should be. Was there a huge disconnect between what the MPs told you they thought their job was or was going to be versus what constituents think the job of their representative should be?
Well, I've never seen anything that asks citizens what they think the job of an MP should be, although we've done a little bit of that research at Samara subsequently, so I'll touch on that in a second. But I think it's fair to assume that if MPs have no agreement as to why they're there, then citizens are probably also confused as to what to expect, and probably that contributes to some of their disappointment. We did do a little bit of public opinion research on what do you think the job description of an MP is, and citizens actually place that accountability function very high. They also see representing your constituents as an important aspect. But what citizens feel MPs are doing at the expense of what they should be doing is actually representing their political party. So a lot of Canadians, at least in survey research, suggest that they feel that representing the party is trumping some of the more essential functions of what an MP should be doing.
And did MPs talk about how they were treated by their respective parties?
This was another surprise. When they expressed some frustration, particularly with how politics operated on the Hill, when we would say, why wouldn't that change, or why is that getting worse, they pointed their finger in a pretty unexpected direction, which was at their own parties, not at the opposition like we're used to seeing. And that surprised me. And I thought, if things like they were unclear how to dissent, we know from voting records MPs almost always vote with their parties, but almost every MP we talked to told us about a time they disagreed with their party. At times, this was some of the most inspirational elements of the interview because they would talk about how they advocated for something that was on the edges. One example I often give, because I loved it so much, was David Anderson, who was elected in his 20s in the 1960s, just after the publication of Silent Spring about the environmental movement. And he passed Canada's first ever and established Canada's first ever Environment Committee that brought a national focus to those issues for the first time. His party was opposed, but he went ahead and did it. So, and there's many stories like that, some wonderful stories of MPs with universities in their riding who came together to put together some really innovative research and scholarship programs that became a plank of Jean Chrétien's legacy. And I could go on. So that's where the sort of inspiring bit is. But the disappointing bit, of course, is that if MPs are uncomfortable in their own parties, should we be surprised that Canadians aren't members of them?
What year was David Anderson? Liberal, right? BC?
Yes.
Okay,
he
what
was,
year?
Well, this was in the late 60s when he was first elected. So this was an older story.
Sure. And that's my point, is that, would we see that today? Would a David Anderson be allowed to dissent from his party enough to be able to go and do what he morally or believes in, or what his constituents feel he should do? Would that still happen in 2014, do you think?
I would like to hope it will, but it is going to take members of parliament who are willing to stand up and do that work. It wasn't easy. You have to take the time to figure out the rules, figure out the right way to frame the legislation or the proposals, figure out how to work with your colleagues so that you can get a base of support. So I believe it's still possible. But and we say this in the conclusion of the book, one of the sort of disappointing things was how many of the MPs expressed frustration with their party and all just turned away and said, I'm just going to go do something else. Or said, I'm an outsider to all this, it's other people that are doing it. Rather than saying, I was elected to make sure that these things happen and I'm going to work doubly hard to make them happen. It's not to diminish the challenges, but I left many of the interviews feeling quite inspired about ability to make change through politics. And I think part of the message from the former members of Parliament to the current ones is, don't lie down and let yourself get run over, but instead, advocate for what you want and work through the system to make the change you'd like to see. So we hope that resonates.
Okay. Let's get rid of the inspirational stuff. I want to be
Back
cynical.
to the dirt.
Back to the cynicism for a minute. Because again, I'm sort of laying this at the feet of, well, some people say, but, I think Canadians largely, or many at least, see sort of the politicians being kind of grotesque, that they're only there to rise up the ranks of the party, to graduate from a backbencher to a cabinet minister and beyond that. What kind of priority? Because you have the real evidence here. When you're talking to these 80 people, did they say, yep, that was my modus operandi, I just wanted to get to be a cabinet minister?
Nobody said that.
Good.
And
Thank you for dashing my cynicism.
But again, it's part of that outsider mentality, anti-politician mentality I was speaking about earlier. People know that the MPs know how people perceive politicians, and they don't want to come off as too ambitious, as if it's sort of an affliction. And it's funny because we encourage ambition in all sorts of other pursuits. For anyone who has a child knows that they encourage them to, pursue whatever they'd like, whether it's the arts, science, journalism, name the profession. Go out, do your best, work hard, and that we don't encourage that in politics. And it's sort of funny because when we feel frustrated about what we see, but yet we have a political culture that doesn't encourage people to say, what, I care a lot about the environment and I want to be the Minister of the Environment one day, then we can't be surprised when we don't get, the same kind of clarity or inspiration we might like to see out of our politics.
Okay. You write in the book, an MP's most effective work gets done in committee meetings, away from the public eye, away from the public attention for the most part. Should we be concerned by that, Alison?
We were a little bit. One of the very common set of words that we heard across many of the interviews was that the, quote, real work always was done in committees. So that was wonderful to hear that real work was being done. It's suggesting, of course, the real work is not question period, which is what most of us see. They also talked about caucuses, which is when the parties get together just with MPs from their own parties and talk and hash out issues, as being another place where the real innovation and good discussion happens. So I suppose on one hand, it's encouraging to know that it's happening somewhere, but it's discouraging that those are often the private venues or semi-private venues of Parliament. So we as citizens don't see that. We don't know that. We rarely participate in it. Instead, we're left with the theatrics of question period, and that's the public representation.
Right, because we're sort of locked out of the transparency and at the same time just being fed political theater, which then leads to skepticism and cynicism.
Yes. And so it's a funny conundrum because most of us, when we're in public, try to act on our best behavior. And it was sort of, again, strange to hear that politicians insist that their best behavior is all behind closed doors and they act terribly in public. That's very opposite of probably the way, at least I try, and probably you try, and most people try to act. So if politics can't show its best face to the public, it's hard to assess if that best face even exists or what it might even look like.
You know, we all, again, see party leaders, the prime ministers of current and past, wield considerable power. Did the MPs say, talk about that being a frustrating experience for them?
They referred often to the party as being a difficult thing to navigate.
It's a behemoth, these parties.
Well, it was interesting because they never said a specific name. So it often wasn't the leader per se, but you know, the people maybe in and around the leader, the people who were involved in the party in other ways. It would almost had a Wizard of Oz quality in when we looked back over the transcripts, as if, you know, who is that man or woman behind the curtain? I don't really know. So this really provoked for us, and we talk about this in the conclusion of the book, you know, are our political parties operating in the way we'd like them to? Because they don't. If MPs are confused about how decisions are being made, then, you know, I'm certainly confused and probably many other people in the public are. And it is the job of political parties to engage the public in politics. And so if MPs aren't feeling engaged, it's probably, again, it's likely that Canadians aren't either. So I think the MPs' reflections really provoke a conversation about modern party politics and whether it's really serving the public. So
your book is like, sort of reveals, you know, it gives us a peek behind the curtain, as you said, from the vantage point of an MP rather than us as citizens. You know, but politics ticks on. The country continues to be governed. The show goes on. The country arguably still, you know, is governed pretty well. How urgent is a problem, these leaks and holes that we have in our commons?
Well, the reason we wrote the book is because this is a classic example of something where day to day you don't really notice, but you look back over a long period of time and say, you know, something has changed here and it doesn't feel so good. So part of what we're trying to do with this book is actually document with people who've been there, you know, what is happening and what it's been like. You know, my view is when you see voter turnout declining as we have, I mean, federally it was 61%, only 39% of young people voted in the last federal election. You imagine if we had 39% of people graduating from high school, we'd be pretty upset, I think, I hope. So, you know, their signs are there, and my view is that we have to start to hear them and watch them and say, okay, how do we start to take the quality of our democracy not for granted, but as critical an issue as we might, you know, any other policy topic.
These men and women you talk to, okay, they've had the job experience. They say, here are the problems as we see it. What suggestions they make? I mean, what's the fix as they see it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was naive in going into these interviews in this respect. I had really hoped that the MPs would provide us with our wonderful, you know, 5-point laundry list, and, you know, on we go. And it wasn't that easy. Their recommendations tended to be quite general. Improving civics education was probably the most consistently mentioned recommendation. And a lot of them, only 2 or 3 people said, and they were often not what pundits talk about. So, for example, only a couple people talked about electoral reform. They were from the NDP. A couple people talked about Senate reform. They were from the Conservatives. It was one of the areas where the parties didn't fully align. But they were really relatively small changes, adaptations to the House schedule, for example. So it wasn't so much what the MPs recommended that led us to our sort of reflection and call to action at the end, but more about the topics they told us about. So one was this sort of lack of willingness to take responsibility for politics, as outsiderism that permeated their reflections. And we talk about the need almost for MPs to heal thyself first before expecting, you know, everybody else to. And then the second is about political parties. And given the amount of frustration they expressed, we do provoke a bit of a conversation about how parties could operate a little bit more openly and transparently. Interestingly, we did some separate research at Samara where we looked at all the riding association websites across the country, of which there's about 1,300 or so if you factor in all the parties and all the ridings. And only 5 of those sites had any information on how to be a candidate. Only 5. Huh. So that's just a snapshot into how political parties don't always operate as openly as at least I and others, including the MPs, might like them to.
Alison Loat, thank you. Thank you for writing this book. Remind me once more before we go, job of an MP. Commit it to memory.
Yeah, to hold government to account. That's the quickest way
I
you
will
can
remember
say it.
that.
And you can read lots more about it in the book if you'd like.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.